This is the kind of case that doesn't just raise questions, it creates a storm of them. Because every time you think the story of Ashlee Jenae and Joe McCann is starting to settle, another layer drops that makes everything even harder to believe. We are talking about a luxury trip to Zanzibar that allegedly turned into a nightmare behind closed doors. Heated arguments from the very beginning. A man reportedly familiar with the island, familiar with the staff, and allegedly far too comfortable moving in ways that now have people asking, was this ever as safe as it looked on the surface? And then comes the timeline that has the internet divided. A hotel attendant. A phone charger. A 10 to 20-minute window. A locked villa. And a discovery that no one was prepared for. Officials say it was a tragic sequence of events, but locals are pointing out details that feel too perfectly arranged. Too clean. Too convenient. Why was Joe reportedly moved far away from Ashlee right before everything unfolded? Why do staff accounts and local reports feel like they're building a timeline that makes one person physically impossible to place at the scene? And why is the autopsy information still surrounded by silence? Then there's the deeper layer, rumors of cheating, past aggressive behavior, and a relationship already breaking long before this trip even began. Now the world is stuck on one question. Was this just a tragic collapse of a toxic relationship? Or is there something far more calculated hiding underneath everything we've been told so far? Picking up from that exact moment, what we are dealing with here is not just a relationship gone wrong. It's a chain of events being reconstructed through hotel logs, local reports, witness accounts, and official statements that still don't fully line up in the public eye. Because according to the Director of Criminal Investigations in Zanzibar, Ashlee Jenae and Joe McCann checked into the Zuri Hotel Villa, specifically Villa number 25, with a planned departure date set for April 10, 2026. On paper, it looks like a luxury getaway. But behind the scenes, the tone of this trip allegedly shifted very early. Reports suggest that arguments between the couple started almost immediately after arrival. Not minor disagreements, but repeated heated confrontations serious enough that neighboring guests became aware. In fact, one key detail states that occupants of Villa 24 actually alerted hotel staff due to the intensity of the dispute. That alone triggered a significant change in how the situation was handled. Hotel staff reportedly intervened and made the decision to separate the couple. Joe McCann was relocated to a different villa, Villa number 65, placed roughly 8 to 10 minutes away from Ashlee's accommodation. Now, that detail is critical in this case timeline because it establishes physical distance between the two at a moment when tensions were already high. It also becomes one of the most debated points later on because it defines opportunity, access, and timing. Fast forward to the evening Ashlee was discovered. At approximately 7:30 p.m., a hotel attendant was conducting routine rounds in the villa area. According to official accounts, he entered Villa 25, where Ashlee was staying. During this interaction, Ashlee reportedly asked him for a phone charger. The attendant complied and provided one. This detail may sound simple, but in investigations like this, even the smallest interaction becomes significant because it establishes the last confirmed human contact. After receiving the charger, Ashlee allegedly told the attendant to return later, around 10 to 15 minutes afterward. The attendant then continued his rounds to other villas, including Villa 24 and 26. However, what happens next is where the timeline begins to tighten. Instead of returning within the short window suggested, the attendant came back after approximately 20 minutes. When he reached Villa 25, he knocked. There was no response. The lights were off, and there was no indication of movement inside. At this point, concern enters the equation. Because according to protocol, the expectation was a quick handover of a charger, not a silent, unresponsive room. The attendant reportedly used an emergency access key to enter the villa. Inside, he discovered Ashlee in a critical condition, suspended from an internal structure using a bathroom robe belt tied to a wardrobe rod. Official reports state she was still alive at that moment, but in severe distress. Immediate alarm was raised, and emergency response procedures were activated. She was transported to a nearby medical facility, where initial stabilization efforts were made. Due to the severity of her condition, she was later transferred to a more advanced hospital for specialized care. Despite medical intervention, Ashlee passed away the following day at approximately 3 p.m. That sequence alone forms the backbone of the official narrative. But outside the official statement, the case quickly became more complicated. Because locals in Zanzibar began adding context that does not always appear in formal reports. According to multiple local accounts circulating through Swahili language sources, Joe McCann was not a stranger to the region. In fact, he was reportedly familiar with the resort staff and had visited Zanzibar multiple times before. That detail changes perception. Because when someone is known in a location, especially within hospitality environments, it raises questions about familiarity, access, and informal relationships that are not always documented. Some local voices even suggest that Joe's presence in Zanzibar went beyond that of a typical tourist. They describe him as someone who understood the environment, the systems, and the people working within it. And this is where public speculation begins to grow. Because if staff and guests already knew him, the question becomes whether that familiarity influenced how events unfolded or how they were later reported. Another controversial point being discussed is the timeline separation itself. Joe being placed 8 to 10 minutes away from Ashlee sounds straightforward on paper. But critics argue that in real-world conditions, that kind of distance can be interpreted in different ways depending on movement, timing, and surveillance coverage. This is also where questions about CCTV footage come in. As of now, there has been no publicly released surveillance footage confirming movement in or out of Ashlee's villa during the critical window. And that absence is exactly what fuels skepticism online. Because in a modern luxury resort setting, even if cameras are not placed inside villas for privacy reasons, there are usually monitored pathways, entry points, and common areas. So the question becomes, what does the available footage actually show, and why hasn't it been made fully public? Meanwhile, investigators reportedly questioned multiple individuals connected to the resort, including staff members and at least one foreign associate linked to Joe McCann, who was also in Zanzibar at the time. This expands the scope of the case beyond just the couple. Now it includes environment, third-party presence, and potential external influences. Another layer that intensified public interest is the claim that Ashlee's family has struggled to receive full clarity regarding autopsy findings. Reports suggest delays and limited communication between Tanzanian authorities and the family, despite the examination reportedly being completed. Her father even reportedly traveled internationally to seek assistance in accessing official information. That alone has fueled frustration and suspicion online. Because in high-profile cases like this, delays often create space for speculation, whether justified or not. But perhaps the most emotionally charged part of this entire narrative is what friends of Ashlee have begun to share. According to close acquaintances, Ashlee had allegedly expressed fear prior to the trip. She reportedly mentioned ongoing arguments and instability in the relationship. Some accounts even suggest she had considered ending things, but felt uncertain due to the intensity of the dynamic. If accurate, that adds a pre-trip emotional context that reframes everything that happened in Zanzibar. Because now this is no longer just about what happened in one villa on one night. It becomes about what was already happening before the plane even took off. And that's where part one of this timeline leaves us, not with conclusions, but with a growing list of contradictions, missing pieces, and unresolved questions that investigators, locals, and the public are all trying to make sense of. Because right now, every detail leads to another question. And every answer seems to create two more. Picking up directly from where we left off, what starts to emerge after the initial timeline is not just confusion, but a widening gap between the official narrative and the details being circulated by locals, investigators, and online discussions. And that gap is exactly what continues to keep this case in the spotlight. Because once the core timeline was established, the villa separation, the attendant visit, the phone charger interaction, and the emergency discovery, attention quickly shifted to what was happening inside the relationship itself before that final night. According to reports emerging from Zanzibar sources and translated local accounts, the relationship between Ashlee Jenae and Joe McCann was allegedly already under extreme strain during their stay. And unlike the calm, luxury image of a resort vacation, what is being described paints a very different picture behind closed doors. Multiple accounts suggest that arguments were frequent from the very beginning of the trip. Not isolated disagreements, but repeated confrontations that escalated to the point where neighboring guests reportedly became aware of tension between the couple. And this is where the cheating allegations begin to surface. Local claims circulating through Swahili language reports suggest that Joe McCann allegedly left the villa on multiple occasions to meet local women during their stay in Zanzibar. These claims are not officially confirmed, but they have become a major talking point because they directly connect to the reported emotional state of the relationship. If these allegations are accurate, then the conflict between the couple wasn't random. It was ongoing, repetitive, and deeply personal. One specific claim suggests that Ashlee confronted Joe over his behavior, leading to heated arguments not just in private, but also in semi-public areas of the resort, including the reception. Some reports even describe moments where emotional outbursts allegedly occurred in front of staff. While none of this has been formally verified in court filings, it is being widely discussed as part of the broader context surrounding the case. And then there's the most controversial layer, Joe McCann's familiarity with Zanzibar itself. Locals have described him as someone who is not unfamiliar with the island. According to these accounts, he had visited before and was known within certain hospitality circles. This is important because it changes how people interpret the structure of events. Because if someone is familiar with a location, understands how resorts operate, and has existing relationships with staff or local contacts, then every movement becomes more complex to interpret. Not necessarily criminal, but certainly more layered. This is where speculation about influence and access begins to emerge. Some online discussions and local opinions suggest that Joe's familiarity may have extended beyond casual tourism. There are claims that he knew individuals connected to the hospitality environment, which has led to questions about whether any informal relationships influenced how events were handled or reported. Again, none of this is confirmed and official. Investigative findings, but it is part of the public conversation surrounding the case. Another major point of discussion is the movement of Joe McCann during the critical timeline. According to the official version, he was relocated to Villa 65, approximately 8 to 10 minutes away from Ashlee's villa. On the surface, this appears to create a clear separation at the time of the incident window. However, critics argue that this detail, while precise, also conveniently establishes distance in a way that removes immediate proximity from the equation. This is where people begin questioning timing versus access. Because even if someone is 8 to 10 minutes away, the real question becomes, what was happening during that entire window, and how is that verified beyond internal reporting? This leads directly into one of the most discussed issues in the case: surveillance footage. Despite being a high-end luxury resort, there has been no publicly released comprehensive CCTV sequence showing movement in or around Villa 25 during the critical time frame. While resorts often prioritize guest privacy, they still typically maintain surveillance in common areas, pathways, and entry points. The absence of publicly confirmed footage has fueled speculation, not because it proves wrongdoing, but because it leaves a gap in visual verification. And in cases like this, gaps quickly become the center of public debate. Meanwhile, investigators reportedly questioned multiple individuals connected to the resort, including staff members and at least one foreign associate of Joe McCann who was present in Zanzibar at the time. This expands the investigation beyond just the couple and places emphasis on the wider social and operational environment around them. But one of the most emotionally charged elements in this entire case comes from Ashlee's family. Reports suggest that her family has faced delays in receiving full clarity regarding autopsy results. While officials have stated that procedures were completed, the release of detailed findings and repatriation processes have reportedly been slow or complicated. This has created frustration and suspicion among family members, particularly her father, who reportedly sought assistance through international channels to gain access to official communication. In high-profile international cases, delays like this often intensify public scrutiny because families are left waiting while speculation grows online. And that brings us back to the most debated aspect of the entire narrative, the cause of the argument that reportedly happened shortly before Ashlee was discovered. Some sources claim the argument stemmed from jealousy and infidelity allegations. Others suggest it may have been triggered by escalating tension throughout the trip, rather than a single moment. One circulating claim suggests Ashlee had accused Joe of cheating during the trip, which allegedly led to a confrontation at the hotel reception area. However, this remains unverified and exists primarily within secondary reports and local discussion threads. What is consistent across multiple accounts, however, is the description of emotional instability in the relationship during their stay. Friends of Ashlee have also reportedly shared that she had expressed concerns prior to the trip. According to these accounts, she had mentioned feeling uneasy and was reportedly considering ending the relationship due to repeated arguments and behavioral concerns. If true, that shifts the timeline emotionally, even if it does not change the physical sequence of events. Because it suggests that what happened in Zanzibar may not have been an isolated breakdown, but the final escalation of an already strained situation. Then there is the most sensitive and widely discussed detail: the engagement ring. Unconfirmed reports circulating online have suggested that Ashlee's engagement ring was recovered in a rental vehicle near the hotel area and that it allegedly contained traces of blood. However, this detail has not been officially substantiated in public forensic reports and remains part of ongoing speculation. Still, it has contributed significantly to the online narrative because symbolic items like engagement rings carry emotional weight in public interpretation of cases like this. But despite all of these circulating claims, one fact remains unchanged. The official investigation has not publicly concluded that foul play occurred, and no formal charges have been announced against Joe McCann in relation to Ashlee's death. And that is where the case currently stands, between an official timeline that describes a tragic sequence of events and a parallel narrative shaped by allegations, local accounts, and unanswered questions. So now the central issue is not just what happened inside Villa 25. It is whether the full truth of what happened before, during, and after that moment has been completely accounted for, or whether critical details are still missing from the public record. Because until those gaps are fully addressed, this case will continue to exist in that uncomfortable space between confirmed facts and unresolved uncertainty. This is the point where the case stops being just a timeline of events and starts becoming a full-scale investigation in the public eye, where every gap, every delay, and every unanswered detail turns into fuel for speculation. Because at this stage, the official narrative and the public narrative are no longer moving in the same direction. On one side, investigators in Zanzibar are working with statements, hotel records, and medical reports to build a structured sequence of what happened inside Villa 25. On the other side, online communities, local voices, and family members are trying to piece together a story that still feels incomplete. And that disconnect is exactly why this case has not faded away. Now, one of the biggest turning points in public discussion comes from the issue of access and control within the resort environment. According to official reporting, the hotel staff acted immediately once Ashlee was discovered and followed emergency procedures. The attendant's involvement, entering the villa using a master key after no response, has been described as protocol-based action. But online, that same moment is interpreted very differently. Because critics argue that the timing of events, especially the short window between the charger request, the delayed return, and the discovery, creates a sequence that feels unusually precise. Not necessarily impossible, but tightly structured in a way that leaves very little visible overlap between individuals in the critical time frame. And that is where suspicion begins to grow, even without direct evidence. At the same time, attention continues to shift back to Joe McCann's location during that window. The official version maintains that he was in a separate villa, approximately 8 to 10 minutes away. That detail is repeatedly emphasized in reports because it establishes physical separation at the moment Ashlee was discovered. However, critics of the narrative argue that distance alone does not fully answer the broader questions being asked. Because what matters in investigations like this is not just where someone was placed, but what can be independently verified about their movements, communications, and interactions during that period. And this is where the absence of publicly released surveillance footage becomes one of the most debated points in the entire case. In a modern luxury resort environment, there are typically multiple layers of security coverage, entry points, pathways, service areas, and perimeter zones. While private villa interiors are not monitored for obvious privacy reasons, movement across the resort is usually partially documented. So when the public does not see a clear, continuous visual timeline, it creates space for alternative interpretations. Not proof of wrongdoing, but absence of confirmation. Meanwhile, investigators reportedly expanded their questioning to include multiple staff members and individuals connected to the resort environment, as well as at least one foreign associate of Joe McCann who was present in Zanzibar at the time. This broader scope suggests that authorities were not treating the case as a simple isolated incident, but rather as a situation requiring environmental context. However, despite these steps, key findings, especially detailed autopsy conclusions, have not been fully released to the public or family in a way that satisfies ongoing concerns. And this is where emotional pressure intensifies. Because for Ashlee's family, the uncertainty is not theoretical. It is personal, immediate, and unresolved. Reports indicate frustration over delays and limited communication, particularly regarding final forensic interpretations and the return of remains. In international cases like this, jurisdictional processes can take time, but the lack of clarity often becomes a secondary issue in the court of public opinion, where timelines feel more urgent than procedures. Then there is the relationship history itself, which continues to shape how people interpret everything that happened in Zanzibar. The allegations of repeated arguments, cheating claims, and emotional instability inside the relationship are not just side details anymore. They are now central to how the public frames motive, conflict, and escalation. Some accounts suggest Ashlee had expressed fear or discomfort prior to the trip. Others describe ongoing tension that escalated during their stay. If these accounts are accurate, then the Zanzibar incident is not a sudden breakdown, but the final stage of a longer emotional conflict. That interpretation is what drives much of the online discussion. But it is also where caution becomes important, because emotional narratives can easily outpace verified facts. At this stage of the investigation, no publicly confirmed conclusion has been issued stating criminal responsibility, and no official charges have been announced in relation to Ashlee's death. That means the case remains officially open, with conclusions pending further review of forensic and investigative results. However, public attention does not operate on the same timeline as legal systems. Online, the discussion has already expanded far beyond the hotel room itself. It now includes Joe McCann's past, including previous relationships, alleged behavioral concerns, and financial speculation. Some of these claims are drawn from past reporting, others from social media interpretation, and many remain unverified in an official context. But collectively, they contribute to a growing narrative that frames the case not as an isolated incident, but as part of a broader pattern being examined through hindsight. And that is one of the most powerful forces in cases like this: hindsight interpretation. Every past detail gets re-examined through the lens of the present. Every argument becomes a potential warning sign. Every separation becomes a potential clue. Even neutral actions become emotionally charged when placed into a tragic context. But despite all of that, there are still hard facts that anchor the case. A couple checked into a luxury villa in Zanzibar. A serious dispute was reported during their stay. Hotel staff intervened and separated their accommodations. A final interaction occurred between Ashlee and a hotel attendant involving a phone charger. She was later discovered in critical condition inside her villa. Emergency efforts were made, but she did not survive. That is the verified structure of events as publicly presented. Everything beyond that structure, intent, motive, responsibility, and interpretation, remains part of ongoing discussion, investigation, and speculation. And that is why this case continues to dominate attention. Because it exists in that difficult space between what is known and what is still unanswered. At this point, the most important question is no longer just what happened inside Villa 25. It is whether every contributing factor leading up to that moment has been fully accounted for in a way that satisfies both the investigation and the people still searching for closure. And until that happens, this case will remain open in the public mind. Not because of what is confirmed, but because of what still isn't. So now I want to hear from you. Do you think the official timeline explains everything clearly from start to finish? Or do you feel like there are still too many gaps that haven't been addressed yet? Because on one side, we have a structured investigation, medical response, and procedural reporting. But on the other side, we have unanswered questions, missing clarity, and a timeline that some people believe still doesn't fully connect. And that is exactly why this case is still trending everywhere. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think this was just a tragic situation that spiraled out of control, or is there more to the story that hasn't been revealed yet? If you want more deep breakdowns like this, make sure you subscribe, turn on notifications, and stay tuned, because as soon as new information drops, we'll break it down step by step. Because this story is far from over.